In 1993, in the small and isolated town of São Vicente, a mystery took over the silent streets and dark forests. Alice, a 9-year-old girl, vanished without a trace. It was an ordinary day, with the sun slowly setting on the horizon, when for the last time she was seen walking alone along a deserted road. The only detail that remained etched in the memory of those who saw her was a red scarf tied around her head, a vibrant touch of color that seemed out of place in the monotonous landscape of that village. Alice's disappearance was the kind of event that no one in São Vicente could have predicted, but deep down, everyone feared. The town, surrounded by dense forests and with few houses, always had an atmosphere of isolation, where rumors spread faster than news. It was the kind of place where any unusual event quickly took on an air of mystery. The search began soon after the disappearance. Alice's parents, desperate, gathered neighbors and friends, and the local newspapers started reporting the case. However, days passed without any clue emerging. The road where Alice was last seen was searched several times, as well as the dense forest surrounding it, but nothing was found. No trace, no footprint, no lost object. Over time, the residents began to notice something strange. Some claimed to have heard footsteps at night near the road. Others said they saw shadows moving between the trees in the distance. The town, which once thrived in the calm of the countryside, was now marked by doubt and apprehension. The red scarf Alice wore before she disappeared became a symbol of the mystery, and what seemed like a simple detail turned into a key for those who believed the disappearance hid something more. What happened to Alice? Where was the red scarf? And the most disturbing question of all, what or who was behind what seemed to be a mystery that would never be solved? In São Vicente, the answers remain as elusive as the shadows that inhabit the forests around it, leaving only echoes of a story still to be unraveled. At first, everyone believed that Alice had simply gotten lost, a curious child. Perhaps she had wandered too far from home and gotten confused in the trails of the forest, or so the residents of São Vicente thought. Her parents, desperate, searched relentlessly for days. They combed every part of the road where she had been seen for the last time, scoured the outskirts of the town, ventured into the dense woods surrounding the village, and asked every neighbor. But they found nothing. No clues, no trace, no sign of her presence. Only silence. The red scarf she had been wearing seemed to float in the memory of those who had seen her. But soon hope faded away, like fog dissipating at dawn. As the weeks passed, rumors began to emerge. Stories whispered among the older folks, gatherings in taverns, furtive conversations at the market. Some people claimed to have seen Alice in strange places, in the shadows of the forest, near an abandoned field at the edge of the town, at the side of a deserted road. Some swore that the girl appeared in an enigmatic way, like a distant vision, as if she were always on the edge of reality. But no one could provide a clear or concrete explanation of what was happening. There were no firm witnesses, only fragments of disconnected accounts, which only heightened the unease among the residents. Over time, Alice's case began to fade into the daily tasks of life. São Vicente, with its characteristic calm and unchanging rhythm, moved on. The disappearance, though still etched in the memory of some, was soon relegated to forgetfulness. Life returned to normal, or at least it seemed to, as if the mystery had been swallowed up by routine. But deep down, something lingered in the air. The shadows in the forest, the abandoned field, the whisper of a lost girl. And the red scarf, now more than ever, seemed to be the only link to a mystery that would never be fully resolved. However, something strange began to happen. Gradually, the quiet nights of São Vicente were overtaken by unsettling reports. At first, they were just rumors, low murmurs among the more superstitious residents, but soon, more and more people began to tell the same stories. On the dark roads, when the sky was covered with stars and the night's mist rose, some people claimed to have seen a mysterious figure. A woman with long black hair blowing in the wind and a red scarf tied around her head, just like the one Alice had worn on the day she disappeared. The figure, however, never came closer. She always remained at a distance, silently watching, as if she were waiting or perhaps guarding something or someone. The sightings occurred at the edges of the forest, on the curves of the deserted roads, But those who saw her felt an indescribable chill, as if the reality around them was distorting. No matter how many times the authorities were called to investigate, there was never any trace of the figure, no concrete evidence. The witnesses were always the same, men and women who, when describing what they saw, seemed more tormented than relieved. The furtive glances and whispers that spread through the town became increasingly frequent. Some said she didn't seem human, that her movements were strange, almost ethereal. Others swore they heard her name being called from afar, but always in a distant way, as if the voice came from another world. It was then that the idea began to take shape among the more fearful. Perhaps Alice wasn't lost. Perhaps she hadn't simply strayed from the road or gotten lost in the forest. Gradually, the belief that Alice was trapped in some kind of limbo, wandering between worlds, began to gain strength. The older residents of the town, with their stories of myths and local legends, began to claim that the girl's disappearance was connected to something deeper, something supernatural. The figure with the red scarf, now a constant presence in conversations, came to be seen as a sign that Alice hadn't truly left. She was there, but not in a physical form, trapped between the two worlds, unable to move on. And the town, which had once tried to forget the mystery, began to live with it, as if it had rooted itself in the silent streets and shadows of the trees. The residents, growing more and more suspicious, began to ask themselves, was Alice just a lost soul, or was something more sinister lurking in the dark nights of São Vicente? In 2003, more than a decade after Alice's disappearance, a group of journalists fascinated and intrigued by the story that persisted in the dark corners of São Vicente decided to investigate the mystery. They arrived in the town with the intention of uncovering the truth, interviewing residents, searching for old documents, revisiting the places where Alice had been seen for the last time. But what seemed like a simple quest for answers soon turned into something much more sinister. The journalists began with the interviews, speaking to the few residents who still remembered Alice and to the older locals, whose stories about the town and its legends were somewhat hazy. During their investigation, they discovered that few pieces of evidence had been preserved. Incomplete records, contradictory reports, and even missing documents. The more they dug, the more they realized that the town seemed to be hiding something, as if its inhabitants themselves were afraid to disturb a past that should remain buried. As they drew closer to the truth, something began to happen. The journalists reported feeling an increasing sense of discomfort, a presence that seemed to be watching their every move, as if someone or something was keeping a close eye on them. But the turning point came when one of the journalists, while exploring the forest where Alice had been seen for the last time, simply vanished. There were no screams, no clues, just absolute silence. His name was removed from the records, as if he had never existed, and his colleagues, stunned and frightened, continued the search, now with greater urgency and a growing sense of dread. In the weeks that followed, other journalists disappeared in a similar manner, one by one like pieces of a puzzle slowly slipping away, dissolving into the mist. Each of the missing had left behind recordings, interviews and footage of the forest and the road where Alice had been seen. The cameras, the audio and the written records became the only clues of what had really happened. But as they watched the footage, something strange began to be noticed. In the recordings, ghostly images started appearing at the edges, shadows moving quickly, as if someone were there but never fully visible. The red scarf appeared in some of the images, briefly flickering in the corner of the screen, as a sign that something beyond human comprehension was manifesting. The truth, the closer they got to it, became more elusive, as if every step toward an explanation was pushing them further away from the reality they knew. The recordings became the only tangible evidence of what was happening, but they also left behind a growing sense of unease. What exactly was happening in São Vicente? Alice's disappearance was just the beginning of a mystery that transcended time, something that now seemed to involve not only the girl, but everyone who dared to approach it. The remaining journalists, now terrified and suspicious, began to wonder if what they were investigating was still a real story, or if they had become part of something much larger, much darker, something that, in some way, had already consumed them. And like a distant echo, the red scarf continued to appear in the footage, a symbol that the past, just like the mystery of Alice, would never be forgotten. The mysterious files, later found, were in a state of disrepair. The images, blurred and distorted by time, and the deterioration of the equipment, seemed to capture fleeting moments of something impossible to understand. The footage showed fragments of the forest, the deserted road, and those enigmatic shadows that the journalists had tried to document. But what was most disturbing were the sounds that accompanied the images. Muffled screams, as if someone were in distant agony, echoed unmistakably, followed by incomprehensible whispers. The voices, laden with a tone that blended fear and desperation, seemed to emerge from the very air, as if the recording had captured a rift between two worlds. The mystery, now deeper than ever, seemed to elude any attempt at a logical explanation. And the oldest residents of São Vicente, who had until then avoided speaking much about the case, began to reveal what they knew, or what they believed they knew. Alice, they said, was not just a missing child. She was not a victim of an ordinary tragedy, but rather an entity, something that had been released, perhaps unintentionally, but now trapped between the worlds of the living and the dead. The elders spoke with fearful reverence, as if the words about Alice were laden with a power that should be kept secret. She did not leave, they said in unison. She was not lost. Alice was chosen, but not to be saved. She was marked, and her fate is different. The more superstitious believed that the disappearance of the girl was not an accident, but an event deeply rooted in something ancient and dark, a force that fed on the threshold between life and death, an entity that, once freed, became condemned to wander between the two worlds. And the red scarf, so simple in appearance, came to be seen as a mark, a symbol of something far more powerful than a mere accessory. The elders said that the scarf was a kind of seal, a connection to a force beyond human understanding. It was not just a piece of cloth, but a key to what Alice had become. The red color, intense and vibrant, represented blood and transition, the border between the living and the spectral. Some believed the scarf was, in fact, a barrier, a link between the world of the living and the beyond, which kept the entity trapped, but at the same time gave it power. Over time, the stories of the older residents became more untenable, more wrapped in legends and myths that no one could tell apart from reality. But one thing was certain: Alice's disappearance had not been simple, and the red scarf was not an insignificant detail. It carried with it the mark of something much greater, something that transcended time and that now, in the blurred images and muffled screams, seemed to be trying to break free, dragging with it anyone who dared to get too close to its mystery. The truth, no matter how hard they tried to reach it, seemed farther and farther away, dissolved between the worlds Alice now inhabited, an immortal entity between the living and the dead. In 2010, after years of silence and mystery, a private investigator, determined to solve Alice's case, decided to go to São Vicente. The town's name, which had already echoed in the corridors of history as a place of inexplicable disappearances, now caught his attention in a new way. He had come across the files of the missing journalists, the rumors about the apparitions, and, above all, the constant link to the red scarf. He felt that there was something there that others had missed, a truth buried under the weight of decades of fear and superstition. Upon arriving in the town, the investigator began questioning the few residents willing to talk. Many were hesitant, as if they feared recalling a dark past, but he managed to extract fragments of information from them that seemed to fit together. However, it was an unexpected discovery that truly caught his attention. A journal, kept in an old chest in an abandoned house, had survived the passage of time. The journal, belonging to someone who had disappeared years before, appeared to have been written by someone who knew more than they should about Alice's mystery. The pages were yellowed, nearly disintegrating as the investigator flipped through them. But the words written there were clear and shocking. The journal described a force that had taken Alice, something that was no longer a child, but an ancient entity, feeding off the life force of anyone who came too close. "She is not lost," the journal said. "Alice was consumed by something much older, a presence that feeds on the vital energy of souls that come too near. Those who cross its path are devoured, and she, always lurking, needs the lives of others to survive." The following words became even more disturbing. The red scarf is the key to everything. It is not just a symbol, but a seal. Whoever wears it, like Alice, cannot escape. The entity is trapped, but the scarf keeps the connection between the worlds. Anyone who tries to destroy it or remove it will be challenging something far beyond human understanding. The investigator felt a chill run down his spine as he read these words. What had seemed like a simple mystery was now revealing itself as something of unimaginable proportions. The red scarf was not just a lost object, but the essence of what had happened to Alice, and to so many others. However, before he could reveal more about his findings, something happened. The investigator, determined to uncover the truth, began sharing his discoveries with the few allies he had made in the town. But on a rainy night, when he was preparing to confront the local authorities with the journal, he disappeared. There were no signs of a struggle, no traces of where he could have gone. His documents were found, his interview records, but he, like the others before him, vanished as if he had never existed. The town of São Vicente was once again consumed by silence, but now a new fear hung over it. The investigators' traces, the reports, and the journal all pointed to a terrifying truth. Alice was not just missing, she was keeping something, or someone, trapped between the worlds. And the red scarf, always present, seemed to be the key to everything, but also the curse that no one could escape. The truth continued to hide in the shadows of the forest and on the deserted roads, so close, yet at the same time so unreachable, as if it were part of something bigger and more dangerous than anyone could imagine. And once again, the mystery of Alice and her red scarf grew darker, consuming all those who dared to come too close to the truth. The reports of apparitions began to intensify over the years, like a cycle that relentlessly repeated itself. Always at the same time of year, when the leaves from the trees began to fall and the cold wind brought a sense of unease, a silhouette would begin to manifest in the shadows of the town of São Vicente. It was the figure of a girl, with black hair and a red scarf tied around her head, exactly as Alice had been seen for the last time. But over time, this vision became increasingly strange and unsettling. Some residents, bolder than others, claimed to see her on the deserted roads, walking alone under the faint moonlight, her steps soft, almost inaudible. Others said the image was more nebulous, as if she emerged from a veil of thick mist between the trees of the forest, like a ghostly presence. Her eyes, when finally seen, were described as empty, lifeless, penetrating, as if they were gazing into the soul of those who glimpsed her. A gaze that was not human, but something much deeper and more disturbing, capable of destabilizing anyone who dared to look into them for too long. There were those who reported hearing her name, Alice, whispered in the wind, like a distant echo that seemed to come from all directions at once. It was as if the town itself was speaking, as if the very atmosphere was impregnated with the memory of her presence. The wind carried her name, and with it came the feeling of an observing presence, one that never came close enough to be touched, but was always there waiting. Others said they heard soft laughter as if she were playing among the trees, but when they searched, there was nothing there, except the emptiness and the sound of the wind that seemed to grow more intense. But strangely, no one ever seemed able to get close enough to understand what was truly happening. Those who tried to approach the figure were always repelled by an inexplicable sense of fear, as if something invisible was pulling them back. Some even tried to follow Alice's silhouette, but it seemed to disappear as soon as they looked at the spot where she should have been. Others reported a feeling of confusion, as if the space around them distorted, making it impossible to focus. The red scarf, still visible from afar, seemed to be the only constant trace in the visions. It would sway gently with the wind, vibrant against the dark backdrop of the forest or the deserted road. But no one ever managed to get close enough to touch it, as if it were a thin line between worlds impossible to cross. Over time, the town of São Vicente became more and more marked by these events. With each apparition, the older residents whispered that Alice was not simply trapped in a parallel dimension, but that she had become an eternal figure, forced to wander between worlds, drawing in those who dared to come too close. Some said the red scarf was the key to her power, and that whoever touched it would become part of that cycle, doomed to follow in Alice's footsteps, never to escape. Each year the apparitions grew more frequent, more intense, and more people found themselves trapped in this mystery they could never comprehend. And while the silhouette of the girl with the red scarf continued to appear, the town of São Vicente remained immersed in a fog of fear and fascination, as if time and space themselves were being diluted by the presence of that entity which never fully left. The mystery of Alice and her red scarf continued, unexplained, like a shadow that refused to disappear. Over the years, an increasingly popular theory began to gain traction among the residents of São Vicente. The mystery surrounding Alice, which seemed to persist like a silent shadow over the town, was taking on even more disturbing contours. The red scarf, once seen as just a simple accessory, came to be interpreted as something much deeper, a mark of choice, a key to something inevitable and frightening. It was said that anyone who saw the red scarf would not escape their fate. No matter how far a person tried to run, the bond was already established. The scarf, now seen as a symbol of an entity beyond comprehension, represented a silent pact. Those who saw it, whether in a vision in the shadows of the forest or on the deserted road where Alice had last been seen, were never the same again. The connection was not just spiritual, but something more physical, something that altered the course of their lives in an irreversible way. Those who had witnessed Alice's apparitions or heard her name whispered by the wind began to show subtle but undeniable changes. Some said they felt a constant weight on their shoulders, a sensation of being watched, as if an invisible presence was always behind them, waiting. Others reported vivid dreams where Alice, with the red scarf glowing on her head, guided them along dark and distant paths. And over time, their destinies seemed to intertwine with Alice's mystery. Nothing seemed to follow a normal course. Their paths became twisted, lost between what was real and what was just a reflection of what Alice had become. The disappearances, now happening with increasingly alarming frequency, seemed to follow a pattern. Those who saw the scarf, or who came near the figures and apparitions, would end up disappearing later. But it wasn't just the physical disappearance that linked them to Alice. Something deeper happened. Their lives, in some way, were erased. They vanished, not just from the world, but from all memories and records. No one remembered them the same way, and in many cases their stories were distorted or forgotten. There was something in the red scarf that prevented anyone who saw it or was touched by it from continuing to exist in the same way. The line between the real and the supernatural began to dissolve, and so the cycle of disappearances continued, feeding the legend of Alice and her red scarf. Each new victim, each new witness added more strength to the story. The accounts of the scarf and Alice's figure became more intense, more real to those who dared to listen, closer to a truth that no one wanted to understand. The red scarf now was no longer just a symbol of a lost past, but the mark of an unchangeable fate. Those who saw it in some way were destined to be part of something much greater, a never-ending cycle where lost souls intertwined, connected, and were pulled into the same darkness where Alice, with her red scarf, waited patiently. What seemed like a simple disappearance had transformed into a web of intertwined destinies, a curse that spanned generations. And the more the mystery spread, the more people were drawn to it, like moths to the flame, until finally, the cycle would begin again. In the night of 2015, when Alice's mystery seemed to have been forgotten by many, a new group of young, curious, and impulsive individuals decided to venture into the forest of São Vicente. Driven by the stories and rumors that still circulated through the town, they believed they could finally find answers to what had happened to the girl and unravel the secrets behind her legend. But what they found that night was something far worse than anyone could have imagined. Armed with flashlights and cameras, they plunged into the dense forest where the tree branches intertwined, creating a mantle of impenetrable shadows. The air was thick with a heavy sensation, as if something was watching every step they took. The silence of the night was absolute, interrupted only by the sound of their hurried steps on the damp ground. It didn't take long for the group to begin feeling a strange presence, as if something was following them, something that never came close enough to be seen, but was always there, waiting. They reached the place where Alice had last been seen, the deserted road, now shrouded in a thick fog that seemed to swallow any sound. But instead of finding only the silence of the night, what they saw was a figure approaching from the shadows. A familiar silhouette, but at the same time completely distorted. It was Alice, or what was left of her. Her eyes were empty, like two dark holes that seemed to reflect nothing but a deep, unfathomable abyss. Her body, once that of an innocent girl, now twisted in an impossible way, as if it were part of something much greater, something much older and monstrous. Her figure seemed to constantly change, as though she were made of shadows rearranging themselves, merging and distorting into shapes that defied any logic. The sight of Alice was like a visual torment, something between the human and the supernatural, something that should not exist. Her presence radiated a dark power, something that wasn't confined to the physical world. When she looked directly at them, her empty eyes fixed on the group, and it was as if time had stopped. A sense of absolute terror overwhelmed each of them, a primal fear, as if they were standing before something that should not be confronted. Before they could react or run, a wave of panic swept over them. The sound of their screams, when they finally tried to escape, was lost in the air, as if the space around them was distorting, swallowing them. There was no more sound, nothing left, except the void and the feeling that they were being pulled into a place where the laws of reality no longer applied. In that moment, the young people didn't know if what they were seeing was real or just an illusion created by something much older and more powerful. But what became clear, when everything calmed down and the fog dissipated, was that Alice's fate, the red scarf, and the force that controlled her were far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The group of young people disappeared that same night, like so many before them, and no one ever heard from or saw them again. The mystery, now darker than ever, continued to grow, fueled by the presence of something that no one should ever try to understand. And as the shadows of the forest closed in once again, the red scarf, invisible but always present, remained the key to a legend that would never be solved. The town of San Vicente, long marked by the unsettling legend of Alice, began to transform as fear spread through its silent streets. The whispers that were once just isolated rumors started to spread like wildfire, taking hold of the hearts of the townspeople. Alice's disappearance, which at first seemed like a tragic accident, was now seen in a new light, darker and more disturbing. The truth, some thought, had never been simple, and the explanation for the events that had followed her departure was becoming increasingly terrifying. With each new apparition, with each account of the red scarf, the townspeople began to believe that Alice hadn't disappeared by accident. No, she wasn't just a lost child, a victim of an ordinary tragedy. For some, Alice had never been a simple girl. She was something far more complex, something much older and deeper. Some began to whisper that she was, in fact, a guardian of a portal between worlds, a link between the real and the supernatural, between life and death. The red scarf, which had always been a distinctive feature of her appearance, came to be seen as much more than just an accessory. The scarf wasn't just a piece of clothing, it was the key that kept the portal closed. That piece of fabric, always tied to her figure, seemed to be the only thing preventing the entity that had taken Alice from fully breaking free, from moving freely between worlds. The scarf, with its intense red color, symbolized the fragile line between what was and what could be, between the human and the inhuman. Each disappearance, each soul taken by the shadows, seemed to feed this portal, making it stronger, harder to control. Those who disappeared, those who saw the red scarf or came too close to Alice's distorted figure, were not mere victims. They were, in fact, part of a cycle that fed the portal, making it more resistant to those who tried to close it. With each disappearance, more power was given to the entity that now took form in Alice's figure, and the more difficult it became to stop the portal from opening completely. The town, consumed by fear, began to see its own streets as prisons, its inhabitants as souls at the mercy of something they could barely comprehend. The legends told by past generations became clearer, more real. The elders, who had long kept silent, now spoke gravely about what had truly happened to Alice. They said that at some point, the girl hadn't been chosen, but had offered herself to protect the portal. However, in doing so, she had lost herself forever, transformed into an entity that now fed on those who came too close to her domain. The town of San Vicente, with its dark alleys and shadowy forests, began to live with the constant sense that everyone's fate was intertwined with Alice's and the red scarfs. Some tried to flee, others took refuge in prayers, but there was an inescapable truth hanging over the town. No one could escape the cycle. The portal, now strengthened with each lost soul, became harder to control, and the line between worlds began to blur. The story of Alice, the girl who disappeared, now seemed like a living legend, something no one could truly understand or defeat. And as the red scarf continued to be the link between the two realities, the town of San Vicente remained at the mercy of a force that, once freed, could consume everything. And so Alice's mystery became even deeper, more intricate, as the town of San Vicente began to perceive something that until then, no one dared to comprehend. Alice was no longer just a victim, not anymore. She hadn't simply been swallowed by the darkness, lost in the shadows of a cruel fate. Alice was waiting for something, waiting for someone. But who, after all, would this person be? And why had she, an apparently innocent child, transformed into the key to something so terrible and ancient? Over time, the townspeople began to piece together a terrifying puzzle. Those who came too close to the mystery, those who dared to investigate, began to realize that Alice was not lost. She was patiently waiting for someone or something to complete her cycle. The legend that once revolved around a disappearance, an unexplained tragedy, was now becoming an even darker and more unsettling enigma. Alice was no longer a victim of circumstance. She was, in fact, the guardian of the portal, the keeper of a reality that refused to close. And what she was waiting for, no one knew for sure. Perhaps she was waiting for the person who would be able to open the portal completely, freeing the entity that now possessed her. But the most terrifying thing of all was what the town began to understand over time. Those who came too close, who investigated too much, would not only lose their lives, but lose something much more essential, their very identity. Those who dared to follow Alice's trail, to dig into the mysteries behind the red scarf, were being pulled into a cycle from which they would never escape. The town soon realized that it wasn't just about physically disappearing. The people who tried to understand what was happening to Alice began to disappear in ways that went beyond simple vanishing. They would fade away, not only from the sight of others, but from their own existence. No trace of them remained, no memory, no recollection. It was as if they had never been part of the town, as if they had never truly existed. Those who were too close or who delved too deeply simply ceased to be, as if the very essence of their identities had been absorbed by the cycle that Alice had begun. The red scarf, seemingly simple, was the key that locked all of these fates. Those who touched it or saw it, instead of finding an answer, were pulled into an endless nightmare, doomed to become part of the eternal wait that Alice had started. The town of San Vicente, which once seemed to live on the fringes of a mystery without further consequence, began to feel the weight of this truth. Everyone was, in some way, connected to the cycle. Everyone was at the mercy of Alice's weight. And the most terrifying thing of all, no one knew who or what she was really waiting for. The only certainty was that as time passed, the cycle became stronger, more difficult to escape. No one dared to investigate anymore. Those who had once spoken of Alice with courage now spoke in whispers, afraid that their words might attract unwanted attention. Some of the older residents, with dark expressions, began to give warnings. Do not look into the forest. Do not follow the winds that whisper her name. And above all, do not approach the red scarf. Because if you do, you will not only lose your life, you will lose everything that makes you who you are. And so the town grew quieter, more haunted as the whispers of Alice and her cycle spread. The mystery, now deeper than ever, had become a silent prison. A prison where, in seeking the truth, one's very identity disappeared, becoming part of something that could never be understood or controlled. The cycle begun by Alice continued, waiting for the next soul to be consumed, waiting for whoever held the key to the portal, and perhaps waiting for someone who, unknowingly, had already been marked from the very beginning. Today, San Vicente remains silent, as if the very air of the town is heavy, laden with the weight of a secret that no one dares try to understand anymore. The sun shines timidly over the deserted streets, but fear still lingers over the old houses and the dense forests. The residents who once lived their lives simply and peacefully now avoid speaking about what really happened to Alice. Her name, whispered in low voices, has become a taboo, a memory that no one dares revisit. The elders still exchange furtive glances when the legend is mentioned, but they quickly change the subject, as if the mere act of pronouncing her name could attract something terrible. The red scarf, the symbol that marked the beginning of it all, is now avoided at all costs. No one dares to speak of it anymore. No one tries to seek answers. And for the few who dared to investigate, the story ended in the same way, with a silent disappearance, without a trace, without explanation. Those who had once tried to solve the mystery, who ventured into the forest in search of a truth, never returned. Their names were erased from the memories of the town, as if time itself had decided to wipe them from history. The legend persists, however, fueled by fear and doubt. Some still believe that Alice was not just a missing girl, but a much more powerful and unsettling force, trying to break the barriers between worlds. They say the red scarf is the key to this portal, and that Alice, now transformed into something beyond human comprehension, is trying to open this path back, drawing souls so that the cycle will never end. The town, then, would be nothing more than a prison for these lost souls, a place where the world of the living and the world of the dead intertwine more and more. Others fear that Alice's true intention is much darker. She is waiting for more souls to complete the cycle, an eternal harvest of fates that stretches beyond what the eyes can see. The red scarf in this case would be a cruel warning, a symbol that those who cross her path, or who by accident glimpse the figure of Alice, are immediately marked. Those who see the scarf, they say, will never be seen again, as if the very essence of the person is consumed by Alice's presence and pulled into the abyss between worlds. And so, the town continues in its heavy silence, as if, with each passing day, another piece of its soul is left behind. Fear still runs through the streets, invisible but palpable, and the legend of Alice remains alive like a shadow that cannot be dissipated. The residents, cautious, look toward the forests and the deserted roads with trepidation, never getting too close, never allowing the red scarf or what it represents to approach, because deep down they all know that, as long as the legend of Alice persists, the cycle will continue. And whoever dares investigate it may discover in the worst possible way that in São Vicente, the truth is a curse that cannot be undone.